April 16, 1945, Weimar, Germany. The war in Europe has 11 days left. Nobody in this city knows that yet. What they do know, or what they'll say they knew later, which isn't the same thing, is that the men with rifles walking beside them are not escorts, they're guards. A column of civilians moves through the center of Weimar on a spring morning. Men in pressed suits, hats, women in heels and overcoats. Someone near the back is complaining about the distance. 5 miles, uphill, to Ettersberg Hill. From a distance, the procession almost looks ordinary. A Sunday walk, a city tour, something civilized. The destination is Buchenwald concentration camp. By the time these people come back down that hill, their faces will have changed in a way that no photograph has ever fully explained. Every detail in this video comes from documented wartime records, military archives, first-hand accounts, and photographs taken by journalists who are on the ground. If that's the history you're here for, subscribe. We don't fill gaps with guesswork. The documented record is already hard enough to absorb. To understand what Patton did in Weimar, you have to understand what Patton was. He was 60 years old in the spring of 1945. He'd been in uniform for 37 years. He had watched men die in ways that most people can't imagine, and he had ordered the deaths of men in ways that he never apologized for. He once told his troops to grease their tank treads with the intestines of their enemies. He meant it as a motivational speech. His men understood it as such. His nickname was Old Blood and Guts. He wore ivory-handled pistols. He believed that a soldier who could not be hardened by war was not worth much to anyone. Then he walked into Ohrdruf. April 12, 1945, 8 days before the forced march through Weimar. Patton visited Ohrdruf, a Nazi subcamp, the first concentration camp liberated by American forces, alongside Eisenhower and Bradley. Robert Murphy, Eisenhower's senior political advisor, was there. He wrote afterwards that Patton went off to a corner, thoroughly sick. The shed contained approximately 40 bodies, naked, in the final stages of starvation, lightly sprinkled with lime, not to destroy them but to reduce the smell while the shed reached full capacity. Patton did not enter the shed. The man who had built an entire identity around refusing to look away stopped at the door. He wrote in his diary that night, "One of the most appalling sights that I have ever seen. Not the worst battle, not the worst wound, the most appalling sight." There's a photograph from that day. Patton is standing outside. His back is to the camera. His face is turned away from the shed. The ivory pistols are at his hip. The helmet is polished. Everything about him is exactly as it always was, except his face is pointed at the ground. 3 days later, he flew to Weimar, intending to set up his next command post. What he found instead changed the plan entirely. Nobody told the men of the 6th Armored Division what was on that hill. Not their commanding officers, not Army intelligence, not the maps. Buchenwald didn't appear on any military map American soldiers were carrying that spring. The camp had existed since 1937. It sat 4 miles north of Weimar, visible from the city on a clear day. And yet, when Captain Frederick Keffer's patrol moved through the woods toward Weimar on April 11, 1945, not one man in that unit knew what they were about to find. They'd just finished a firefight. A small group of SS soldiers had opened up on them near a village called Hottelstedt, then broken contact and disappeared into the trees. The patrol pushed forward. Then the men came out of the woods, ragged, barely standing, speaking what sounded like Russian. One American soldier in the group happened to speak Russian. He translated. They were prisoners. There was a camp, very close. Keffer's men radioed for medical support and moved toward the fence. What they found was this: a barbed wire perimeter at least 10 feet high. Inside, approximately 21,000 prisoners still living, out of a normal population that had reached 80,000 at its peak. Since the camp opened in July 1937, 56,545 people had died within its wire. The SS had begun evacuating prisoners weeks earlier, forcing tens of thousands on death marches deeper into Germany before American forces could reach them. The men who remained were not men in any condition the soldiers recognized from experience. Harry Herder, of the 5th Ranger Battalion's C Company, wrote later that nothing had prepared him. No briefing, no training, no prior combat. He said, "There was no way for those of us at the bottom of the ladder to have any idea at all where we were going or what we were up to." Then they got through the fence, and they got a clue, as Herder put it. The first clue. Some soldiers handed out their rations immediately. It was the instinct of men who had been trained to help. Several prisoners died from it. Bodies that had been starving for years could not process normal food. The army medics who arrived in the following hours had to physically stop soldiers from feeding the survivors. Nobody had prepared them for that either. Within 48 hours, word had reached Patton. Within 72, it had reached Eisenhower. Within the week, it would reach every major newspaper in the United States. But first, it had to reach Weimar. On April 15, 1945, Eisenhower sat down and wrote a cable to General George Marshall in Washington. He had just come from Ohrdruf. He had walked through every section of the camp deliberately. Every room, every pit, every structure. He said later that he did it on purpose, not because he wanted to, because he understood, with a clarity that few military commanders had shown about anything in this war, what was going to happen after it ended. People were going to forget, or they were going to claim they never believed it in the first place. The word propaganda was going to appear in newspapers within months, maybe years. Someone, somewhere, was going to suggest that the stories had been exaggerated, that the photographs had been staged, that the numbers were inflated. He had seen it before, the way atrocity hardens into abstraction the moment it stops being immediate, the way distance turns horror into rumor. So he walked through every corner of Ohrdruf, and then he wrote the cable. He told Marshall he wanted 2 groups sent to Germany immediately. First, journalists and editors from major American publications. Second, a congressional delegation, members of both the House and the Senate. He wasn't asking for coverage. He was building a record, a body of witnesses that could not, later, be collectively dismissed. His reasoning, in his own words, was straightforward. "I want to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things in case there ever develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." A dozen senators and congressmen arrived within days, led by Senate Majority Leader Alben Barkley. The photographs of their visit ran on front pages across America. Barkley was photographed standing in front of stacked corpses outside the Buchenwald crematorium. He was not a man who cried in public. The photographs suggested otherwise. On the same day Eisenhower wrote that cable, April 15th, CBS correspondent Edward R. Murrow walked into Buchenwald with a recording device. Murrow had built his reputation on language, on finding, in any situation, the right words. He had broadcast from London rooftops during the Blitz. He had never been at a loss. He stood inside Buchenwald and told his listeners he barely knew how to begin. He described what he saw, the men who weighed no more than their bones, the smell, the faces, and then he said something that no prepared broadcaster says on air. "I pray you to believe what I have said about Buchenwald. Not, I report. Not, I have been informed. I pray you to believe." The broadcast ran on April 15, 1945. Millions of Americans heard it. Letters poured into CBS for weeks. By then, Patton had already issued his order for Weimar. Weimar was not an ordinary German city. That matters. Patton knew it. The choice was not random. For 2 centuries, Weimar had been the cultural capital of the German-speaking world. Goethe lived there, Schiller lived there, Liszt conducted there. The city had produced, or drawn to itself, a disproportionate share of what Germany called its civilized identity, its literature, its music, its philosophy. When Germans spoke of their cultural inheritance, Weimar was the word that appeared most naturally. After the First World War, it gave its name to a republic, the Weimar Republic, Germany's first attempt at democracy. The city meant something. It stood for something. Its residents knew this about themselves, and they carried it with a particular kind of civic pride. Buchenwald was 4 miles away. The camp had been built on Ettersberg Hill in 1937. On a clear day, the chimney was visible from the city below. For 8 years, the residents of Weimar had shopped at the same markets, walked the same streets, attended the same concerts. Some had worked in factories alongside prisoners from the camp. The smoke had been a feature of the skyline. When American forces arrived, the response from Weimar's citizens was consistent, immediate, almost rehearsed. We didn't know. Patton had heard this before. At Ohrdruf, the locals had said the same thing. At Ohrdruf, 40 leading citizens had been brought to see the camp, and the next morning the Nazi mayor of the nearby town and his wife were found hanged. Their position had become, in one night, impossible to maintain. Weimar was a larger problem, a more prominent city, a city that had built its entire identity around the idea that it represented the best of German civilization. Patton's order was specific. 1,000 citizens, predominantly men of military age, drawn from the middle and upper classes. Armed escort, 25 kilometers, round trip, on foot. They would be shown the crematorium, the conditions of the prisoners, the evidence. No exceptions for high heels, no exceptions for pressed suits. He gave the order. He did not explain it at length. He did not need to. There is a version of this story where Patton is performing something, making a point, demonstrating power, putting on a show for the cameras. That version is probably too simple. What the documented record shows is a man who had stood outside a shed in Ohrdruf, unable to go in, and had decided that the people who lived 4 miles from Buchenwald, who had lived 4 miles from Buchenwald for 8 years, were going to go inside. He wasn't going to ask them. The column entered the camp at Ettersberg Hill on April 16, 1945. They had walked 5 miles. Some of them had complained about the distance. Now they were inside the wire, and nobody was complaining about anything. The American soldiers did not rush them. There was no narration, no guide explaining what they were seeing. The route was chosen deliberately. They walked through it in order. First, the administration buildings, the records, the ledgers that logged prisoner arrivals with the same bureaucratic precision as a hotel registry. Name, origin, date, number. The numbers ran into the tens of thousands. Then, the pathology department, the specimens, the human skin. The camp's former commandant, Karl Otto Koch, had been executed by his own SS superiors just 11 days earlier, not for the murders, but for corruption. His wife, Ilse Koch, had been known to select prisoners with distinctive tattoos. The fate of those prisoners and what remained of them was on display. Some of the Weimar civilians were doctors, nurses, educated people. Several of them fainted. Those who did not faint kept their eyes moving, looking for somewhere to look that wasn't what was in front of them. The American soldiers did not allow it. They were here to see. Then the crematorium. The ovens were still. The camp had been liberated 5 days earlier, but the structure made its function self-evident. The capacity, the efficiency of the design, the ash. One American officer, overseeing a separate burial detail nearby, had told his German conscripts to dig. When the men complained about the heat and the smell, he did not explain. He did not negotiate. He said, "Dig, you sons of bitches." Patton would have said the same. And then the survivors appeared. There were still more than 20,000 of them inside the camp, skeletal. Many were too weak to stand without support, but some of them walked toward the column of Weimar civilians, and they had something to say. The civilians had been repeating it since they arrived, the same phrase, automatic, almost reflexive. Wir haben es nicht gewusst. We didn't know. Margaret Bourke-White was standing there with her camera. She documented what happened next. The survivors heard it. One repetition, then another. We didn't know. We didn't know. Then the prisoners broke. They shouted, in German, in the languages of a dozen occupied countries, in whatever words they had left. The core of what they said was simple. You knew. We worked beside you in your factories. We told you, at risk of our lives. We were here, 4 miles from your city, for 8 years. The smoke from this hill reached your streets. You knew, and you did nothing. The Weimar civilians stood inside the wire and received this. There are photographs from that day,
groups of civilians standing in front of the crematorium, looking at trucks loaded with corpses. Their faces in those photographs are not the faces of people who are morally processing something new. They are the faces of people who can no longer maintain a position they have held for a very long time. By 3 in the afternoon, the column had begun the walk back down the hill, 5 miles, downhill this time. Nobody complained about the distance.
The civilians walked back into Weimar that afternoon. They returned to their houses, their kitchens, their lives. The same streets they had walked that morning, before the hill, looked the same cobblestones, the same facades, the same neighbors, some of whom had not been selected for the march and were waiting to hear what it had been like. What happened inside those houses that night is not documented. What happened in the days that followed is Ohrdruf, not Buchenwald, Ohrdruf, the smaller camp, the one American forces had liberated first. When citizens of the surrounding area had been brought there to see the bodies, the Nazi mayor of Gotha and his wife had gone home afterward and hanged themselves. They left a note. It said we didn't know, but we knew. 9 words, no elaboration, no defense, no request for understanding. The note read like a man who had finally stopped arguing with himself, written down the conclusion, and acted on it. The mayor of Gotha was not a minor figure. He was a party member, a civic official, a man who had administered a city 4 miles from a concentration camp for years and had done so without apparent difficulty, and had said, when asked, that he knew nothing of what happened there. He went home from Ohrdruf and hanged himself and his wife, and wrote 9 words. In Weimar, the days after the forced march produced something different. The city's representatives convened. They deliberated. They issued a formal statement. The citizens of Weimar, the statement said, bore no responsibility for the crimes committed at Buchenwald. The note from Gotha had not changed anything. The march had not changed anything. The faces of 20,000 survivors, the ovens, the files, the skin, none of it had produced, in official Weimar, a single formal acknowledgement of shared responsibility. Margaret Bourke-White had photographed the civilians inside the camp. Those photographs ran in newspapers and in Life magazine. American readers saw the faces of Weimar's citizens standing in front of the crematorium. They saw the expressions. They drew their own conclusions. Weimar's official position remained what it had been before the march. Eisenhower had predicted this, not about Weimar specifically, but about the impulse, the way institutions close around uncomfortable facts, the way a city, like a person, can look directly at something and then walk away and begin the process of not having seen it. That is why he had built the record. The journalists, the congressmen, the photographers. The record does not require the subject's cooperation. It simply exists. Buchenwald was built in 1937. Weimar had been there for centuries before it. The distance between the city and the camp is 4 miles. On a clear day, and there are many clear days in Thuringia in spring, the chimney on Ettersberg Hill is visible from the streets below. Not suggested, not implied, visible. For 8 years that chimney was part of the skyline. The people of Weimar bought bread. They attended concerts. They walked their dogs in the squares that Goethe and Schiller had walked 2 centuries before them. They sent their children to school. They complained about the weather and the cost of things and the length of the war. They lived ordinary lives in a city that considered itself the custodian of German civilization. 4 miles away, 56,545 people died. The smoke from the crematorium traveled downhill. Wind patterns in the region are well documented. On certain days, the smell reached the city. This is not an argument. These are not accusations. This is geography. This is meteorology. This is what the documents show. Patton did not stay in Weimar. He was relieved of his command in Bavaria that October, partly for going too easy on former Nazis in the denazification process, partly for remarks that embarrassed the army. He died in December 1945 after a car accident in Heidelberg. He never wrote at length about the forced march. He didn't need to. The photographs exist. The records exist. The testimony of the survivors exists. Eisenhower's instinct turned out to be correct. Within years, the word propaganda appeared in exactly the places he had predicted. The record he built, The journalists, the congressmen, the photographers became the primary bulwark against it. Murrow's broadcast is still studied in journalism schools. Bourke-White's photographs are in the permanent collection of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The New York Times report from April 18, 1945, is available in the archive. The note from Gotha, 9 words, has been quoted in history books for 80 years. Buchenwald is a memorial now. The camp was partially dismantled. Then the Soviets used it as an internment camp until 1950 and dismantled the rest to hide that fact. What remains is preserved. There is a museum. There are guided tours. Weimar is still there. It is a UNESCO World Heritage City. People visit for the Goethe House, the Schiller residence, the classical architecture. Ettesberg Hill is 5 miles away. On a clear day, you can still see it from the city.